Hi, I'm Patty Cason. I'm a family nurse practitioner and I have a specialty in sexual and reproductive health. And I'm going to talk with you today about new contraceptives that have become available this year. Here are my disclosures. These are our learning objectives. All of the methods that we're going to talk about today are hormonal methods of contraception. And for all hormonal methods of contraception, it's the progestin component that provides the contraceptive effect. Estrogen is put into combined hormonal contraceptives like pills and patches and rings only for the benefits that only estrogen can bring. Estrogen can cause proliferation of the endometrium, and then when you have a hormone-free interval, it allows time for the uterus to bleed, which is how you schedule a bleed with a combined hormonal contraceptive method. Perhaps the person seeking a non-contraceptive benefit from estrogen, like acne control. The contraceptive effects of progestin will vary greatly depending on the dose of progestin that's in a given method and the potency of the progestin that's in a given method. And the range of contraceptive effects will go from ovulation suppression because of suppression of LH and FSH surges, and production of thick cervical mucus, which doesn't allow penetration of the sperm through the mucus to go up into the uterus and up into the fallopian tubes. That mechanism, thickening of cervical mucus, is a mechanism of action for all hormonal contraception, both combined hormonal contraceptive methods like pills, patches, and rings, as well as progestin-only methods. And then, very importantly, progestin will thin the endometrium, and that thinning is a very healthy effect. It also can cause bleeding differences from the way somebody might be bleeding if they didn't have a contraceptive hormone in their body. And then its ability to reduce tubal motility and cilial action may or may not have very much of a contraceptive effect. The contraceptive effects of estrogen are less prominent, and they are kind of there as a helper, if you will. When we think just purely about contraception, it can potentially help suppress ovulation, but also really think about what it's doing to the endometrium. It's proliferating the endometrium, and that's allowing there to be enough endometrium so that when there's a hormone-free interval, a time when the person is not using their combined hormonal contraception for 4 to 7 days, that will allow a time to schedule a bleed. The estrogen has proliferated the endometrium, and then the cessation of the progestin and estrogen component of the combined hormonal contraceptive being taken away, that is what's going to allow a scheduled bleed. Various progestins that are in contraception have different characteristics. For example, drospirenone is anti-androgenic. Levonorgestrel has a lot of effect to stabilize the endometrium and is androgenic. But when it comes to the contraceptive effect of a progestin, it's more about the dose or the potency of the progestin than about the characteristics. Both are important, but let's think about how a progestin prevents pregnancy. So when it comes to a very minimal systemic dose of progestin, like with a levonorgestrel IUD, you're going to rarely, if ever, see ovulation suppression. With the smaller IUDs, the 13.5 and 19.5 levonorgestrel IUDs, you virtually never see ovulation suppression. With the 52 milligram levonorgestrel IUDs, the Liletta and Mirena, you do sometimes see some ovulation suppression or effect to the ovulation initially, but it's not a reliable mechanism of action. Now, let me just backtrack and say with all progestins, as I mentioned earlier, there will be thickened cervical mucus. So we'll just say that's for any dose, any potency. Follicular growth, because you are not suppressing ovulation with this very low dose of progestin that you have with a levonorgestrel IUD, you really have no reason not to have follicular growth. There's no suppression. When it comes to a low dose of progestin, like in a norethindrone progestin-only pill. And I shouldn't say that it's a low dose. It is a low dose. It's even a lower dose than you would see in a combined hormonal contraceptive that has norethindrone in it, or most of them. But it's that it's not a very potent progestin, and it actually has a pretty short half-life. So it doesn't reliably suppress ovulation, although sometimes you may see ovulation suppression. It could also have follicular growth attendant to it because it doesn't suppress ovulation. very reliably. But even if it did suppress an ovulation in a given cycle, it would not tend to suppress follicular growth. Then we come to the mid-potency or mid-dose progestins. So that would be the implant, the etonogestrel implant, and the drospirenone progestin-only pill that's brand new. And then combined hormonal contraceptives. So the progestin that's in a pill, patch, or ring that also has estrogen in it. So these are going to reliably cause inhibition of ovulation. And they could have follicular growth. But generally, because they are really reliably suppressing ovulation, you see a little bit less of that than you would with a method that wasn't reliably suppressing ovulation. And then we come to the really high dose of progestin that we see, and it's not so much a high dose as it's a really potent progestin as well, but it is a high dose of depomedroxyprogesterone acetate, which is the injection. There's 150 milligram IM dose that we're all accustomed to, and then there's the 104 milligram subcutaneous dose. In both cases, there's reliable suppression of ovulation, and in fact, it actually can shut down all ovary function, and that's why we do see a hypoestrogenic state in some cases with people using DMPA. That's probably where the reduced bone density that we see with people who are long-term users of DMPA comes from, because of the hypoestrogenic state that's caused by the shutting down of the ovary. The nice thing is that there is not follicular development in that case. So if you do seek a non-contraceptive benefit that involves reliable suppression of ovulation and in fact reliable suppression of ovary function, DMPA would be where you'd want to go. So as I mentioned, any method of contraception that has progestin in it is going to cause thickening of cervical mucus as a main mechanism of action, and it will also thin the endometrium reliably, any method that has progestin in it. There are some benefits to suppressing ovulation. One of them would be treatment for PMDD or PMS. If the person's using a combined hormonal method like a pill, patch, or ring, continuous use is best if you're treating PMDD. Whenever you suppress ovulation reliably, you're causing the person in their lifetime to ovulate fewer times. Similar to what you would see if somebody were to be pregnant or breastfeeding over and over again in their life. So if you aren't pregnant or breastfeeding throughout most of your life, then you might have what some refer to as, quote, incessant ovulation, which may be closely tied to ovarian cancer. So if you suppress ovulation reliably over some period of time, that's going to have a wonderful benefit of reducing risk of ovarian cancer. You also reduce the risk of endometrial cancer with any progestin or combined hormonal method. But additionally, if you suppress ovulation, you have a good shot of at reducing risk of ovarian cancer. So let's look at progestin-only pills. In particular, we do have a new one, so I wanted to highlight that. Currently on the market in the United States, there are 2 progestin-only pills. One has been around for a very long time, and it has northindrone at 0.35 milligrams. That's what we've generally been using. Some of the brands are Micronor, NorQD. So with the northindrone, you take 1 tablet every single day. There are no hormone-free intervals. There's no placebo pills. 1 active pill every single day. As soon as 1 pack is done, you just immediately go directly into the next pack. And now there's also a new pill called Slind, which is the brand name, and it's drospirenone, and it's 4 milligrams. That pill is set up to take continuously for 24 days, followed by 4 days when the person either takes placebo or takes nothing, and that is a hormone-free interval that is designed to be the time when the person has a scheduled bleed. This new progestin-only pill is the same progestin, drospirenone, as is in Yaz, Yasmin, Ocella. It actually acts very similarly in the body to spironolactone. So it has a diuretic effect, it has an anti-androgenic effect. Spironolactone and drospirenone have been used for hirsutism, for example. So interestingly, while the dose of drospirenone in the progestin-only pill is 4 milligrams, and the dose of drospirenone in combined oral contraceptives is 3 milligrams, the functional amount of drospirenone that the body actually has circulating every day is higher in the combined oral contraceptive than it is in the progestin-only pill, even though the dose is lower. And that's because the estrogen potentiates the drospirenone, so it actually functionally is a higher dose in the body. It does have the 24/4 dosing regimen specifically to try not to have bleeding that is unfavorable, to schedule a bleed. Most people want to have control over when they bleed, so that's a way to be able to allow that to happen. It doesn't mean the person has to do it that way. It is the way that it is set up, and it is the way that it's FDA approved, but there's no health downside to going ahead and using it continuously without a hormone-free interval. But the hormone-free interval is put in there specifically to allow a time to schedule a bleed. And if you do use it continuously without a hormone-free interval, that is an off-label usage. But as I said, there should be no safety concerns with that. The reason that you can do that, have a 4-day hormone-free interval, is because it is, number one, reliably suppressing ovulation. And number two, it has a very, very long half-life, like a 36-hour half-life. So you can miss a pill and be late with a pill and still have a lot of grace. It doesn't have the kind of thromboembolic risk that you would see with a combined hormonal contraceptive, combined oral contraceptive, because without the estrogen component, you do not have the cardiovascular risk. So you don't have that cardiovascular risk, obviously, with norethindrone either. Hopefully, your patient's insurance will cover this, but since with ACA, they're only required to cover one method in a given class, it's possible that it won't be on all formularies, although I know that they're trying hard to get it on all the formularies. But if your patient's not covered for SLIND, then they can use the savings program that's outlined here. But unfortunately, it is actually not valid for people with public health insurance. So let's hope that it gets on all the formularies. Norethindrone in the progestin-only pill has some disadvantages, and hopefully the new drospirenone pill will address some of those. So the most important problem that we have with the norethindrone pill is it's a very short half-life. So by the end of a 24-hour period, the person using it is going to have serum levels that are really low and possibly not even protective. So you have to take the pill at exactly the same time every day to be able to maintain the serum levels that are going to maintain the thickened cervical mucus. So that, added to the fact that it's not reliably suppressing ovulation, means that there's not a lot of room for error. And none of us is perfect. So it'd be really better if we didn't have, as our only option for progestin-only pill, something that you have to be that careful about. It's hopefully, if it gets on all the formularies, it's going to be much easier to be adherent to a progestin-only pill with drospirenone in it, because the drospirenone's long half-life allows you to be late with your pills or miss one and then make it up, and you're still going to be protected. So that's quite important. And the fact that it reliably inhibits ovulation is actually a pretty big difference as well. So let's move on to looking at the new contraceptive patch that's in town and the new vaginal ring. These are both combined hormonal methods. You've probably known about the little square one there for quite some time because it's been out since the 90s. And in clinical trials, we do see more failures in people with higher BMIs. Other than that, there's the same contraindications with these patches, both of them, as with any combined hormonal contraceptive, same side effect profile as with any combined hormonal contraceptive, same effectiveness as any combined hormonal contraceptive. And the two brands are different in that, in addition to one being round and one being square, one of them is lower dose than the other. So that's the big difference now. Both of them, as I said, are combined hormonal contraceptives, and with both of them it's okay to swim, shower, exercise, and the patches are not likely to peel off. They sometimes can, but that's not usual. So with Xulane, which is the patch that's been around for a while, it was Evra was the brand, and then Xulane was the generic that came along and then replaced Evra. So it has both ethinyl estradiol and norelgestromin, and it's got one patch per week for 3 weeks, and then a hormone-free interval of 1 week without any patch, and that's when the scheduled bleed is meant to occur. Now, with this patch, in trials where they look at the serum levels of estrogen, you are starting to see about 60% higher dose of estrogen with this patch than you would with a combined hormonal contraceptive pill with about 30 or 35 micrograms of estrogen. So 60% more estrogen, that's pretty significant. So we are concerned about DVT risk. We don't, for that reason, love the idea of somebody using this patch continuously without a hormone-free interval year after year. If occasionally the person would like to not have a bleed, it's perfectly fine for them to skip the hormone-free interval. But to do it continuously for a long period of time risks exposure to higher doses of estrogen. So the new patch, the round one, is Twerla, and it functionally does have an equivalent dose of estrogen to a 30 microgram pill approximately. So it is lower dose than the other patch, and therefore we don't have quite the concerns about that 60% higher estrogen dose that we did with the with Xulane. I'm using the brand name because there's only one. Both of these patches have a contraindication for people over a BMI of 30. And actually, Twerla in the clinical trials showed reduced efficacy even with a BMI over 25. It was a slope up. It wasn't like all of a sudden it became ineffective, but there were more failures in BMI over 25. And then significantly, again, more failures over 30. So FDA has decided to make both products contraindicated for anybody with a BMI over 30, because the failure rate with Xulane also does go up with increasing BMI. So there are no data yet to say that Twerla is safe to use continuously for an ongoing, undetermined length of time, years potentially. But the company is doing a clinical trial looking at that, and we do think that because it has a lower dose of estrogen, it is probably more like a regular low dose combined oral contraceptive or a combined hormonal contraceptive ring. So we think that this will probably be safer for continuous use. I like the idea of continuous use in general because it allows much more grace period for somebody to forget to restart their patch or restart their pill or put their ring back in. It's just having continuous use means that you don't allow time for the ovary to wake up, and if the person forgets to restart after their hormone-free interval, that's a time when they could have a method failure. So this using the method continuously actually makes that impossible because they don't have an interval with which they are going to be scheduling a lack of use, which can then lead to somebody forgetting to start back again. So we're looking at norelgestromin of 150 in the Xulane and levonorgestrel 120 in the Twerla, so they're different progestins. And the daily release rate of ethinyl estradiol, as I said, is 60% higher with Xulane, and the 30 micrograms a day in Twerla is actually close to where it's measured actually in the serum. And then let's look at the new vaginal ring. You may or may not have heard of it. This has been around slightly longer. It was from last year. And if you look here on the far left, NuvaRing is 4 millimeters by 54. So 4 millimeters in diameter and then 54 millimeters across. And you can see that compared to a dime, so you know the shape. You probably already know the size anyway. Anovera is very similar in its size, in its dimension. It's just 2 millimeters wider. But it's quite different in its thickness. It's 8.4 millimeters instead of 4. So that's quite a bit thicker. This actually, if you're doing any kind of work with people post-menopause, this is much more like a postmenopausal systemic hormonal vaginal ring. So the new contraceptive ring is called Anovera, and it's a combination of segestrone acetate and ethinyl estradiol. Pretty much all combined hormonal contraceptives have ethinyl estradiol as the estrogen component, except for one pill that's fairly new, that's branded, that has 4 phases, and there's also several new pills in development that will have a different type of estrogen as well. But for the most part, we've been dealing with ethinyl estradiol for a very long time, since I've been in practice. So this was available starting at the end of last year. It's actually good for an entire 365 days, which is pretty exciting. It's got all the same contraindications, side effects, mechanism of action as any other combined hormonal contraceptive. And as with all of those, it does not protect against STIs. Neither does the contraceptive patch or the Progestin-Only Pill that I talked about earlier. They don't protect against STIs or HIV either. So if we do a direct comparison, you can see that there's a different type of progestin in each one. Etanogestrel, which is in the Nuva Ring, is what's in the contraceptive implant in the United States. They both have very low ethinyl estradiol. We talked about the size already. And the Annovera is good for 365 days in the way that it's designed and approved by FDA is for it to have 3 weeks in, 1 week out. So it's designed to have a hormone-free interval of 7 days, although it's highly likely that this will be well suited to continuous use, as is Nuva Ring. They're both flexible. As you saw, Annovera is sort of an opaque white, and Nuva Ring is more transparent. They're both fine outside of the fridge. If Nuva Ring is going to be around for more than about 4 months, you would be better off refrigerating it, but not so with Annovera. So the Nuva Ring itself is meant by FDA approval to be used with a hormone-free interval, where you have it in for 3 weeks and out for a week. But it's much, much better, in my opinion, to use the ring continuously. Or if you are not going to use it continuously, to use it with a shorter hormone-free interval of 4 days, and to make that hormone-free interval be either the first or the last 4 days of a given calendar month to make it easier for your patient to remember. With all hormonal methods, with all birth control methods, we really want quick start. So the day to start this ring, as well as Annovera and any of the other combined or progestin-only methods, start the day that the patient's asking for it. So the Annovera, as I said, same thing, quick starting, designed to be 3 weeks in, 1 week off. Let's talk about some of the specifics. You can remove it for a maximum of 2 hours, where Nuva Ring is removed for a maximum of 3 hours. And the reason why this is getting removed frequently is because it is kind of thick, so women are preferring to take it out for intercourse some of the time. It doesn't mean everybody will, but that's something that we are seeing, and that's unfortunately the time when people might forget to put it back in. So that's actually a potential for disrupting adherence. And otherwise, same as all combined hormonal contraceptives with contraindications, side effects. The bleeding profile should be very similar to the ring with etanogestrel in it, Nuva Ring. Interestingly, from a cost perspective, this is not in the same FDA category as Nuva Ring. So it has to be covered with no cost sharing under ACA. So that's extremely good news. So I keep touting continuous use. The goal of continuous use, there's many goals, but the goal is to have no bleeding. So if the person wants to have a bleed, the only way you can reliably give that to them is with a hormone-free interval, and then that's when you'd want to take it out for 4 days out of each calendar month. Otherwise, if they want to use it continuously, the goal would be that after some period of time, whether that's immediate or after 3 to 6 months, that they really wouldn't have bleeding of any kind. The continuous use, as I mentioned, gives a lot of margin for error, and it doesn't allow the ovary to wake up at all. And the lovely thing about this ring is that it's good for at least 5 weeks. So if the person forgets to take out their February ring and put their March ring in, and it's now March 7th or March 14th, and they remember, they're still protected, because 5 weeks of contraceptive effect, at least, and then you tack on what would have been a 7-day interval, that gives you 6 weeks of grace period. And that's great. So if the person is late forgetting to put it back in or put a new ring in, they're still okay. Same thing with forgetting to take it out. If they forget to take it out for an extra couple weeks, they're still okay. If the person does have bleeding or spotting or something that feels to them like a little light, what would have been like a little light period, they can at any point take the ring out, and this would be the same for aloe vera if you're going to use that continuously. You would take it out for 4 days. The person would have more of a little bleed, like a light period, is how I tell people to think about it. And then they just put that same ring back in again, unless of course you happen to have gone for those 4 days from 1 month to the next, and then you put the next month's ring in. Each month has a ring if it's Nuva ring. If it's aloe vera, obviously you're using the same ring all year. So as I said, we don't have data on aloe vera using it continuously, but it seems like it's going to be a really good option. When I talked about taking the ring out for 4 days, allowing the person to have a little bit of a bleed and putting it back in again, I didn't stipulate that you don't want to do that more than once a month, because if you do, you're starting to again have a hormone-free interval that is long enough or frequent enough so that you're allowing the ovary to wake up, and you don't want that, because one of the things you're really looking for with this is suppression of ovulation. So let's look at injectables. There is not a new injectable actually FDA approved, but there's a new injectable to many of us. So it's been around for a long time, but we haven't really thought about it until COVID-19, when we were shutting down our clinics and we wanted to allow our patients to still get their birth control, and using DMPA, the injectable, themselves started to become a really attractive option. I think it's always been a really attractive option, but we finally started to really think about it seriously because of the constraints that COVID-19 has put on our practice. So the depot that we're all used to has 150 milligrams, and we give it to people IM. The other option is subcutaneous, and it's 104 milligrams. And because of the route of administration being subcutaneous as opposed to IM, one of the differences is in the way that the drug is metabolized. You actually end up having very similar amounts of systemic absorption. So it's still the 104 milligram sub-Q is still a very, very high dose. Just like with the 150 milligram. Both of them suppress ovulation, both of them thicken cervical mucus, and in fact both of them do a pretty good job of shutting down ovary function, which is where that hypoestrogenic state comes in. With the sub-Q version, it actually has to be administered every 12 to 14 weeks, not 12 to 15. So with the DMPA 150, the one we're used to, we have a grace period up to 15 weeks. We don't know that that's going to be the case with sub-Q because it's we don't have the data yet to show that. These are the 150 is indicated for both contraception and endometriosis, and even if the client is on a concomitant medication that's an enzyme-inducing anti-epileptic, for example, that's very likely to reduce the serum level of contraceptive hormones, that because of the high dose with the DMPA, that becomes less of a concern. Also, there is some possibility, some data that there's higher seizure threshold, less seizure activity in people that are using high-dose progestin. Both the IM version of DMPA that we've known for so long and this sub-Q version have the same contraindications. Both of them have the same guidance by the U.S. medical eligibility criteria for contraceptive use and the selected practice recommendations by CDC. The only difference is the reinjection window. We want to be sure to stick to the 12 to 14 weeks for the sub-Q version until we have more data. There is the possibility that while we at this time assume the side effect profiles are the same, there is the possibility, since there is a lower dose of depomedroxyprogesterone acetate in the sub-Q version, that there may be fewer side effects. And it is likely to have all the same benefits. So how does it differ? Importantly, there's a much smaller, shorter needle, which is pretty great, a smaller volume of fluid, so that's also going to result in less pain, less discomfort. It comes pre-filled, and so the person can use it themselves at home if they wanted to, although this is indicated only for clinic use or for office use. It's not actually indicated for self-use, which doesn't make sense. That's how it was originally conceived, but that's not how it was FDA approved. So this would be an off-label use if you had your patients self-injecting. Because people are self-injecting, and this really only applies to self-injection, it may be an injection or two before they work out the kinks, so they could have some site reaction for the first 1 or 2 injections. And then according to the label, 1 out of 100 experience dimpling at the site of injection. Other comparisons between the sub-Q and the IM dose. The needle, as I said, is much smaller with the sub-Q, 26 gauge, 3/8 of an inch, as opposed to 22 gauge, 1.5 inch. And with the sub-Q, as I said, it comes pre-filled, and the DMPA 150 could either come pre-filled or in a vial. So anybody can learn to do this, or anybody potentially could learn to do this, but it is really good for people who are already experienced in self-injection. So somebody who's been using fertility drugs, somebody who has diabetes, somebody who is using medication for MS. So you're going to use your best judgment when you talk to somebody about this, but I love the idea that we are going to be helping somebody with in autonomy with their contraceptive method, to actually be able to provide something to somebody where they don't have to come into the office every 3 months. If they love their depot, but they don't love having to come in every 3 months, I think that's a big advance. Here are the sites where somebody would self-inject if they were going to self-inject, and again, this is off-label. Tummy, thighs, right or left, and here's where you would have a wonderful resource for finding out how to do it if you're going to help your patients learn how to do this themselves and you're going to provide it for them. I will tell you, sadly, it's not really very available right now in the United States. People are having a little bit of difficulty with supply, but I am hopeful that that will be resolved soon. And here are just a few more resources for Depot Sub-Q, and thank you.